So hello everybody and welcome to this new meeting of the Financial Line Seminars. Our guest today is Santiago Mejia.
Mejia, but it doesn't matter.
Okay, Mejia.
Yeah.
And so thank you, Santiago, for being here today with us. And it's a pleasure to have the Financial Line Seminar. And so Santiago will give a talk titled Shareholder Ownership and the Common Good. And so, Santiago, thanks again for delivering your talk, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation, Emiliano, and thank you all for coming. So, I changed the title, I didn't realize. This is a very weird paper. Whenever I tell anybody that I'm writing a paper defending that shareholders are the owners of the corporation, this is always the response. Now, the reasons for the perplexity are not the same. Some people ask me, why defend something that is obviously true? Other people tell me, why defend something that is obviously false? Now, the people in the second camp are usually business ethics, what you might call progressive legal and management scholars. And the people in the first camp are pretty much everybody else. Now, I work in the second camp, but I agree with the people in the first camp. And I was kind of like annoyed enough at some point about not being able to say, well, I think shareholders are owners without like feeling that I was saying something crazy. And then I decided to write this paper, or to sort of like, I haven't finished it writing, but whatever. So here's the bottom line of why I think shareholders should be considered the owners of the corporation. First, because they have ownership rights over the corporation. And here I'm relying kind of like on the kind of arguments provided by Huntsman. So shareholders have the right to benefit, to appropriate the corporation's profits as the residual claimants, and they have the right to control the corporation, among others, by electing the board of directors, the corporation's, which is the corporation's ultimate decision-making authority. Now, if you also think about how would you structure an organization that is for profit and that is supposed to be owned by numerous owners and needs active management, I think you would very quickly see how a corporation is the right way of organizing it. But that means that owners, when they decide how to organize themselves, they decide themselves around the corporation. Now, there's two alternatives to my view, which I want to describe clearly. And there's a lot of challenges to my view, which is what I'm going to spend most of the time, or a significant chunk of the time talking about. So the first alternative is that the corporation is unknown. This is very popular among legal scholars and economists who are interested in corporate governance. And the idea is like that the firm is a network of contracts. And that once we accept that the firm is not an entity, an independent entity, but actually a network of contracts, then the organization decomposes into groups, investors, managers, creditors, employees, who negotiate an equilibrium position among themselves. Now, from this perspective, no class of participants, in particular shareholders, but also that would count also for managers or creditors, have a natural right to view themselves as the owners. Everyone is just like one particular constituency, kind of like, negotiating with the others. So shareholders are not the owners. They're simply the suppliers of equity capital that are like contracting around with the other sort of like constituencies that are needed for the corporation to function. Now, the reason why I think this is a mistaken view is that even though I agree totally that shareholders don't have any natural right to view themselves as owners, they have actually negotiated such a right. As part of the negotiation of the contracting negotiations is they have sort of like acquired the right to own the corporation. So differently, even though they're suppliers of equity, and that's the fundamental role, they have negotiated rights, ownership rights in exchange of such equity. Now, the second really pervasive view, and this is pervasive specifically in business ethics and legal scholarship, or some corners of the legal scholarship, consider that corporation is self-owned, so the corporation owns itself. Just as people own themselves, corporations own themselves. Now, according to the law, and this is dependent especially by Lynn Stout, so she argues that according to the law, all corporate assets belong to the corporation, not to shareholders. Now, corporations, she argues, like people own themselves because corporations, like people, are capable of holding property on their own names, entering their own contracts, and committing their own torts. So corporations operate like persons, persons own themselves, their corporations own themselves. So she argues that from a legal perspective, shareholders do not and cannot own corporations, that they are independent legal entities that own themselves, just as human beings own themselves. Now, there's two things to say in response to that. Like, first of all, that corporations own themselves is not a legal fact. That hasn't been sort of like explicitly stated in any of the legal documents. They infer that Stout and also Stout infers that from the kind of like properties that I described, right? Now, different entities are capable of holding property in their own names, entering their own contracts, and committing their own torts. And some of those entities can be owned. So having those capacities, holding property in their own name, entering contracts, is not, it does not in itself entail that the entity is self-owned. Now, also the idea that all corporate assets belong to the corporation, I think doesn't really substantiate that the corporation is its owner, because the corporation is not, and I think is not understood as a collection of physical assets. And therefore, owning these assets is not owning itself. Like corporate ownership, I think, entails ultimate control over an assemblage of contractual rights, none of which need to be involved physical assets. And Hansman had this nice example in his book about a sports franchise, which might just like contract every single thing. They can just rent all the properties and establish contracts with the individual teams without ever having to sort of like own anything. And what the owners own is not any property, but just like the ability of sort of like deciding how to contract around with those different parties. Now, the main criticisms, to my view, is that shareholders have very limited control rights. And I'm going to sort of like show why that's the case, but also why that's, I don't think is devastating or concluding. So I'm going to focus on Delaware because this is actually one of the least shareholder-centric and most sports-centric jurisdictions in the world. It is usually conceived that this is like this jurisdiction is particularly favorable for managers and not to shareholders. And therefore, I think by focusing in Delaware, I'm kind of like in some ways trying to make my life difficult, but also Delaware is super important. So at the same time, like, you know, I also fulfill that. Now, in most jurisdictions, corporate law seems intentionally designed to weaken and interfere with shareholders' ability to exert control over the corporation. And this is particularly clear, as I was saying before, in Delaware. Now, Stephen Bainbridge, a really prominent legal scholar, has said shareholder control rights are so weak in Delaware that they scarcely qualify as part of corporate governance. The alleged control rights of shareholders are a mere ceremony designed to give a veneer of legitimacy to managerial power, has argued another prominent scholar. In public corporations, dispersed shareholders do not find it worthwhile to get informed and coordinate to votes. And therefore, shareholders are rationally apathetic, and therefore they don't seem to sort of be engaged in any kind of way with the corporate affairs. And as such, dispersed shareholders have almost no power to elect directors or to do anything. Now, Elizabeth Blair and then Stout in a seminal paper argue that corporate directors, which is the ultimate decision-making body within the firm, are not subject to direct control or supervision by anyone, including the firm's shareholders. Even if a firm, and this is not true, for instance, in England, but it is true in Delaware, even if a firm's shareholders were to pass a unanimous resolution directing the board to pursue some course of action, declaring a dividend, firing a particular executive, selling a particular division, the board has no legal obligation to comply, even if this resolution is unanimous. As I said before, like this is not true in many other legislatures, but it is true in Delaware. Now, the board is also, when you think about how the board is nominated, I'm arguing that one of the reasons why shareholders are owners is because they have the power to elect the board. But the boards, when you see public corporations, the board are effectively self-nominating, or usually, or in most cases. The election of directors without a proxy context is predetermined by the existing board members. When a couple of board members step down, the board decides who to nominate for the next year's board. And the shareholders basically have just like two candidates for two positions. Now, only directors have authority to call a special shareholder meeting, and shareholders so if you want to sort of like make certain changes and want shareholders to sort of like try to make changes, you cannot call a special shareholder meeting. You cannot decide in any point when shareholders want to sort of like have a meeting to sort of like try to sort of like change the board. Shareholders have to wait for the annual meeting to try to elect or remove directors. And if they want to elect or remove directors different from the ones that the board elected, they must pay to solicit their own proxies, and that can be very expensive. So because of that, Alan Strudler, in a funny sort of quip, mentioned that shareholders' right to vote is a formality, much like the right to vote for government leaders in North Korea. So corporate laws seem intentionally designed to weaken shareholders' control rights. The corporation is a separate entity that owns a corporate asset and contracts in its own name. The board election is almost predetermined by the old board. Directors are not subject to direct control or supervision by shareholders, and shareholders have almost no power to elect directors. Now, I don't want to disagree with any of that, but I think that doesn't actually settle the point. And actually, I think that doesn't actually show that shareholders do not have the power to elect directors. And I think to understand that the distinction in Aristotle between first potentiality and second potentiality, I think is helpful. So I want to argue that shareholders' power to elect directors, especially in a public company that has diversified shareholders, should be seen as a second potentiality, but as a real power. Now, as I said before, shareholders find it is difficult for dispersed shareholders to exercise the right of control in public corporations. Now, Hansman has argued that that right of control should be considered a formal right, but I want to argue that this is not a mere formality, as Strudler says. It's a real, genuine formal right, and it has real power. So to clarify that, let me make a comparison with French speaking, right? And what is first potentiality and second potentiality? Now, when you think about a rock, there's no sense in which a rock has the potential to speak French, right? Rocks lack any potentiality to speak French. Now you think about a young baby. A young baby has the capacity to speak French, but the capacity is peculiar because the baby cannot yet speak French. So the capacity of the baby is a capacity on first potentiality. Now, when you think about an adult French speaker who is currently not speaking, perhaps because she's apathetic, she has the capacity to speak French, but she has the capacity in second potentiality. Second potentiality because it's a power that she's not exercising at the moment. But the adult, unlike the baby, could exercise her capacity to speak French in the here and now if she wanted. So what I want to argue is that shareholders' ability to control the corporation is an instance of a second potentiality. Like the apathetic French speaker who does not want to speak, widely dispersed shareholders are apathetic to exercise their vote and to sort of make their voices heard, because the benefits of making that are seldom worth their efforts. But the reason why they have little control is not that they lack the capacity to control the company, but that they're not exercising this capacity, like a French person who's not speaking French. Collectively, they are not investing the necessary efforts to come together to do so because it's not worth their efforts. Now, it is worth mentioning that a rock has no ability to control the corporation in any kind of way, and other stakeholders, so employees or consumers, have the right to control the corporation in first potentiality. So sometimes corporations are sold or given to employees and become employee-owned, or can become consumer-owned. So when corporate governance structures change, then those stakeholders have a right of control or an ownership right of the corporation, but in first potentiality. Right now, they don't have the ability. Now, again, if shareholders really want or really need to make changes in the corporation and the board is really unresponsive, they usually mobilize their efforts and exercise the control rights in the here and now. And two salient examples are ExxonMobil and Danone, where the shareholders are were able to nominate two different board members than the one that ExxonMobil had. And in Danone, shareholders were able to sort of get the chairman and CEO of Danone to resign. Now, that the fact that they have those rights is shown by the fact that when a controller shareholders acquires their shares, they can exert significant control, right? So for instance, Twitter, when Elon Musk, Twitter was a public company, there was a lot of diversified shareholders. When Elon Musk bought the company, he had a lot of control that the other shareholders were not exercising, partly because they were dispersed, but a control that was there in potentia in them, in second potentiality. Now, I want to clarify, I think that it's shareholders as a whole, not individual shareholders, who have control rights. Properly speaking, it's shareholders as a whole that have control rights. Now, let me address the legal challenges to my view. So far, the dialectic has been the following, right? I've shown that shareholders have the right to control the company in second potentiality, hopefully. But I still need to explain why so many of the corporate laws seem designed to interfere with such capacity, to undermine the alleged ownership of shareholders. Why is it so difficult for shareholders to actually get boards to be changed? Why is it so difficult for shareholders in Delaware to sort of make their voices heard? and the voices being sort of like having so little power. Now, there's a number of arguments to explain that. First of all, weakening shareholders' control rights facilitate decision-making among shareholders. It protects minority shareholders from majority shareholders. It responds to practical considerations, and it obeys to sometimes legitimate and sometimes illegitimate political considerations, path dependencies, and just like the vagaries of the lawmaking process. I'm going to speak about the first three and just give one example of each, try to argue how the challenges can be perfectly met by someone who thinks that shareholders are the owners. So first of all, one of the challenges to shareholder ownership is that shareholders have too weak control rights to justify calling them owners, right? Now, to see why it's valuable to weaken their control rights, it's often helpful to recognize that to manage a collective property that requires active management and is owned by many individuals, you need a governance structure where much of the decision-making is delegated to a small group of people. This fact alone, I think, goes a long, long way to explain why the rights of shareholders are limited and why they delegate so much of the administration to a board and the CEO. If shareholders are constantly sort of like getting involved, are constantly interfering with the board and the CEO, the company is kind of like much more unstable. The board and the CEO provide like a certain kind of stability to the company and ability to sort of like exercise decision-making power. Now, independent legal personhood facilitates contractual relationships. It doesn't facilitate that, the corporation is its own. It just facilitates that, the corporation which is owned contracts with others. That the fact that corporations is an owner of all the assets secures the lock-in of capital. So because the corporation is the owner, shareholders cannot like go and sort of like request some of their alleged sort of like ownership of the capital. And therefore, by securing lock-in capital, it secures the long-term continuity and stability of the firm. Partnership are problematic because a partner can at any time sort of like want to sort of like liquidate the company. By having the corporation own its assets, a shareholder cannot liquidate the company, it can only sell the shares. Now, corporation as owners of the assets also shields corporate property from personal creditors and other owners. So any creditor that's trying to sort of like chase me because I haven't paid them cannot go after the corporation's property because the corporation is the owner of that property, not me. And that's a particularly valuable thing to incentivize shareholders to come together and invest. Now, shareholders as a whole are and should be recognized as the ultimate owners of all these assets. They can reclaim them by nominating a board that will liquidate the company. And they have the power, at least in second potentiality, to nominate a board that will liquidate the company. So if shareholders really, really want to become real owners of the corporate assets, they can just liquidate the company. And of course, pay all their debts, and after whatever's left, they can get those assets. So I've explained why owners need to delegate most control of the board and structure their collective ownership as an independent legal entity. And again, this explanation helps to explain why corporate law facilitates separating ownership and control, why so much of the control is not given to the owners or delegated to the boards and CEOs. But it does not explain why corporate law seeks to increase rather than decrease agency costs between shareholders and boards. Now, to understand that, which I think is an important insight, you have to recognize that corporate law seeks to address three agency problems. First, conflict between managers and shareholders. Second, conflict between controlling and non-controlling shareholders. And three, conflict between shareholders and the corporation's other contractual counterparties. Now, I want to talk about the second claim, the second kind of like important consideration that goes into corporate law, which explains why shareholders' control rights are weakened so much. And the fact is that there is an important advantage for owners when they weaken their own power and strengthen the power of the delegates. Ceding control to delegates reduces the need to monitor other owners. If different owners don't have much power, then all you have to look at is at the delegates, not at the owners. And if you have many, many owners, it's better to just trying to look at the delegates instead of looking at the owners. It also protects owners from the opportunistic behavior of other owners. This is like the flip coin of what I just said. And finally, minority owners who might be afraid of shareholders with substantial ownership are more likely to invest if they know that these other shareholders with substantial ownership have weak powers. So weakening the power of shareholders, and of course that means strengthening the power of the delegates, incentivizes minority stakeholders and reduces decision-making costs among shareholders. So how much do you want me, should I speak for, Emiliano? Is it 45 minutes?
Yeah, 45, it's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna skip, or let me say, like, one of the most important challenges to claiming that shareholders are the owners is that the business judgment rule affords a lot of laxity to shareholders, right? So the business judgment rule gives boards and managers a lot of discretion. When a shareholder tries to sue the delegates, the board, the court will almost always presume that the delegates are acted properly. They will not even sort of like take that challenge on. And because of that, the business judgment rule has been called like an ironclad shield for directors of public corporations. It makes directors and their actions almost unassailable. And that suggests that shareholders actually don't have power. The power is given to managers. And it's given to managers because they're not owners. Now, I think the business judgment rule explains partly why it's valuable to sort of like give this power to boards, because it's the way in which that constitutes delegation. And also, it also explains why it sort of like weakens the shareholders' right and therefore incentivizes minority shareholders. But what I want to mention is like that it also responds to practical considerations, right? There's cases where rules and standards that might sound good in theory turn out to be unfeasible in practice. So the business judgment rule, namely the laxity it affords to shareholders, prevents derivative suits, namely lawsuits, from flooding the courts. And also because judges are not particularly qualified to assess ex post the business decision of expert corporate directors and officers. They typically, it's just better for them to defer to their authority. Okay. So let's assume, hopefully you'll be convinced by now, that shareholder ownership can explain the challenges of corporate law. Now, I don't mean to sort of like say that what I've argued establishes that shareholders are owners. I think that corporate law is sufficiently ambiguous on this front that, you know, you could, I think, compellingly argue both ways, right? But what I have done, I think, is show how we can explain how all the assumed alleged challenges of corporate law can explain, or can be explained by someone who wants to say that shareholders should be considered the owners. Now, so what I've done so far is just like fend the objections. I haven't actually established my case. Now, I have also sort of like helped myself of talking about ownership rights, but my claim has actually shown that shareholders have actually ownership powers, not ownership rights. Now, you might think that shareholders are given these powers, but they don't have these rights. And again, Blair and Stout are one of the people who could speak into defending that view. So they argue that we give these powers to shareholders, this power to elect the boards, this powers to sue the corporation, these powers to inspect the books, because this benefits all stakeholders. But they argue that shareholders should use these powers not to look after their particular interest, but to look after the interest of all the corporation stakeholders. Now, you might think that this is that the normative perspective, thinking that you give these powers and then they're going to use them for the common good or something, or for the good of all stakeholders. You might think that that perspective is naive. And even though I think that's correct, I don't think that that criticism should be particularly compelling for two reasons. First of all, there's many demands in moral philosophy that are similarly naive. And even if they're naive, they don't lose their normative force because of this, right? Second, there are many instances where people have ownership powers that they use to pursue the rights of others. In particular, there are many nonprofits where boards are self-appointed. They have powers that are not constrained by a different constituency to nominate, vote, and remove them. But nevertheless, they use this power to promote the benefit of other parties. And so why do I want to say that shareholders have ownership rights and not merely ownership powers? And there's basically two reasons. First, because they agreed to participate in the firm in exchange for these rights. And second, because these rights are recognized by all those who contracted with the firms. Let me talk about each of these two in turn. So first of all, investors set up the firm to secure these rights. A firm usually starts with an idea that a founder has, or a couple of founders have. The founder can organize the firm in any ways they want, right? As a nonprofit, as a consumer cooperative, as a worker cooperative, producer cooperative, or as an investor-owned cooperative, right? And many founders decide to just set up a nonprofit or a worker cooperative. Now, many founders organize the firm as investor-owned, because this is usually the most profitable for them, and that's usually a powerful motivation for founders, but also because this tends to be the best way to guarantee the success of the enterprise. Capital is critical and hard to get in good terms without corresponding ownership right. Now, when the corporation is set up, founders and capital investors come together to negotiate the terms on which they will collaborate, right? Investors want a slice of the profits, and to ensure that they will get it, they demand control. So when the parties who create the firm set it up, they all agree that shareholders have ownership right, not merely ownership powers. They agree that shareholders have these rights because they have the power to get control in order to then ensure sort of like a slice of the profits. Now, that doesn't have to be always the case. For instance, in OpenAI, Microsoft agreed to sort of like put a lot of capital without having ownership powers, as you saw when Sam Altman was fired, despite Microsoft not finding that particularly compelling. So there's different ways of organizing an organization, but if it's a corporation, it means that the parties agree to set it up so that shareholders have ownership rights. And this right, again, allows shareholders to make sure that their interests are pursued. Now, when they decide to pool the resources, they choose a legal form to operate. They can choose a corporation, but they can also choose a partnership, a LLC, a benefit corporation, an S corporation, etc. Now, and in general, they all think of these forms as different ways to associate to pursue their interests as species of the sort of like same genus, right? As Velasco has said, the form of business organization, I think, is a legal technicality. They choose one legal form versus another because of how they will be taxed and what kind of delegation and protections they will receive. Now, oftentimes they choose a C corporation because of its potential to lure minority investors in public markets, because of their potential for those corporations to go public in a way that's appealing. It's very difficult to have a partnership, have a lot of investors, for instance. Now, if investors and shareholders knew or expected, as Stout argues, that the corporation would involve relinquishing their ownership rights, that they have these powers, but they have to relinquish their ownership rights, if they thought that this legal form required them to put the interest of all stakeholders in a level playing field with their own, they would not choose it. They chose it because they saw it as a facilitating mechanism, corporate governance mechanism to pursue their self-interest. Now, so when they set up the company, I think shareholders have these rights, not just these powers. Second, those that contract with the firm recognize investors' ownership rights. So the idea that shareholders don't own the corporation is held by some legal, management, and business ethics scholars, but all of them acknowledge that shareholder ownership is the dominant view, widely held by the public, investors, managers, employees, etc. And this matters, I think, for shareholder ownership, because it suggests that all these stakeholders interact with the firm on the expectation and knowledge and recognition that shareholders are its owners, right? I'm not going to skip this. So here's a really puzzling feature of those who criticize shareholder ownership, right? And is that most of the critics agree that shareholders are owners if the corporation is privately held, closely held, or majority controlled. Most of the argument and the challenges that Delaware law brings to shareholders only have strong force when you have a diversified set of shareholders that is widely diverse and very numerous. If you have a controlling shareholder, that controlling shareholder has a lot of power to elect boards and to sort of like get their voices heard. Now, if these corporations are owned by their shareholders, namely privately held, closely held, or majority controlled, when do they become unowned or self-owned? And I think the answer that many of them give is when they become public. But that's kind of like really puzzling, because all it takes for a company to become public is to exceed a threshold of investors or total assets sometimes, right? When a company goes public, the fundamental structure of the company's corporate governance does not change at all. All that changes is that now the company has certain audit, reporting, and disclosure requirements. Why would this audit, reporting, and disclosure requirements that increase transparency to shareholders, and in that way kind of like strengthen them as owners, have an effect on the corporation's ownership? Again, there has been no change in the corporate governance arrangement. And this is a really puzzling fact of those who criticize shareholder primacy, or shareholder ownership. Now, also, according to critics, when you take a company public, shareholders are expropriated of their ownership rights because they had ownership rights before they took the company public. But then how do they sort of like potential shareholders that might want to buy an ownership stake, a majority ownership in the company, acquire and regain those rights? And finally, here are a couple of further reasons to support shareholder ownership. The first has to do with like limited liability and who is liable when the corporation fails. In general, owners, and this is not just about corporations, this is in general, owners are responsible for the consequences caused by the property. And it's owners, not capital providers. Like when a company fails, those who lend capital as lenders don't have to sort of like, put up for their property. Now, limited liability protects shareholders specifically. And that suggests that it protects owners. But when limited liability is abused by shareholders, courts usually pierce the corporate veil. Courts, in that case, allow third parties to go after shareholders' personal assets. But when a company is mismanaged, it is only shareholders' personal assets that can be pursued, nobody else's assets. And that suggests, again, that shareholders are the owners. Now, shareholders have other rights that I think also suggest that they are the owners. They're the only constituency that can launch a derivative suit. They're the only constituency that can say, you know what, I want to sue on behalf of the corporation. And they're the only constituency with the right to inspect the corporation's books and records. Now, further, corporate law in many jurisdictions, including Delaware, recognize, either in their laws or in court decisions, that shareholders are owners and directors owe fiduciary duties to them. And again, owning corporate assets and owning corporation is different, right? They don't suggest that by owning the corporation, they own the assets. It is the corporation that owns the assets. Now, you might say, well, okay, so what? If you understand exactly what are the rights of shareholders, who cares if they're owners or not? Well, I think, first of all, this is the correct view. This view, recognizing that shareholders are owners, recognizes that shareholders have a certain primacy in the corporation, that they have ownership powers and ownership rights. And the alternative, I think, falsifies how our social corporate arrangements actually operate. And in doing so, I think it obfuscates and does not allow us to properly understand the rights and duties of different stakeholders. Now, in the alternative, where shareholders are not considered owners, the obligations that would apply to managers of public companies would not apply to private, closely held or controlled corporations. And that means that it would exclude a lot of really powerful companies like Cargill, Koch Industries, Twitter, Fidelity Investment, McKinsey, PetSmart, Sequoia Capital, etc. So we still need an account of the managerial obligations that apply to these shareholder-owned companies. And what I'm trying to suggest is that, if you think that shareholders are owners in the case of public corporations, you have just one account for all of them, right? This approach conceptualizes public, private, and sole ownership as instances of the same species. And it therefore asks business entities to provide a unified account of all for-profit corporations. And methodologically, it allows managers to think of their obligations by thinking about what would be their obligations if they were owners. And I think, this is actually in some case makes more salient what their obligations are, and actually allows managers to actually see that they have more obligation than they actually think so. Now, I think my approach also focuses on our attention on a critical issue to which we should be paying more attention, namely, what are the moral obligations of shareholders as owners of single-owned, private, or public corporations, right? And it also forces us to sort of reckon and confront how to empower their delegates to fulfill these obligations that shareholders have. Now, of course, the fear, and I think the reason why many people in business ethics and in law and in management want to deny that shareholders are owners is that if they're owners, they can do pretty much what they want with the corporation. And you can just point to Twitter and how Elon Musk has been doing whatever he wants with Twitter. But that doesn't follow. Defending shareholder property is not defending property absolutism, as Rodger Claessing in a book that she's writing recently wrote. When we think about property that we have, like watches, phones, tables, chairs, we are used to thinking that we can do what we want with our property. We can use a phone to hammer a nail, or we can just use a chair and just destroy it and burn it. But when it comes to owning things like land, capital, data, patents, there are and should be limits on what we can do with them, right? Private property gives owners power over others, powers that may, among other things, give rise to problematic personal domination. Again, this is an argument that Rodger is making in his recent work in progress. Now, because corporations play such a pivotal role in our socioeconomic landscape also, I think owning corporations saddles its owner with a duty to use it responsibly in a way that is not, as an owner of a chair, I now have such responsibilities. Although even then, I think I have certain responsibilities to use my property responsibly. Now, private property is and should be regulated so that it promotes, or at least does not undermine, the common good. Now, there is quite a bit of work to articulate what these limits should be and the cases where they should be imposed or self-imposed, and in particular, what kind of like regulation and self-regulation should sort of like guide the kind of like responsibilities that owners have, right? Whether they should be imposed through consumer and labor regulation, through, say, co-determination agreements. By the way, I think that German companies are shareholder-owned, even though they have co-determination, and I can talk about it in the Q&A. Whether we should sort of like revive certain kind of like ultra-virus legislation, whether we should sort of like highlight the duties of productive use for owners, etc. And I think we should be more intentional as business ethicists and legal scholars about articulating what these limits are and how they can be implemented. But I think to do that, you have to start by recognizing that shareholders are actually owners. Thank you. Let me see if I can stop sharing. Okay, this works this time.
Okay. Thank you very much, Santiago, for this fascinating talk. And we can now open the debate, and everybody in the audience can ask questions. And I can see Peter asking.
Thank you,
willing to ask a
Santiago.
question.
This is great. So I in my business ethics
People
class,
hate it when I present about this.
No, I really like it. So in my business ethics class, I kind of start out with the liberal theory of the firm, the idea that shareholders are owners of the firm, and then I bring in David Siepley's work. I didn't see him cited, but you probably know his work. So he's in the other camp, right?
Yeah.
And I actually find his arguments very convincing. Now I admit that you've destabilized me a little bit, right? But so I'm going to try and make a comeback here from the other side. So some of the arguments that Siepley invokes are ones that you invoke too. So for instance, asset lock-in and entity shielding. If I as a shareholder put my money in, I can't just take it back. And so Siepley says, look, this shows us that it's not really my property in the usual sense that we understand property, right? So one argument you made at that point is that, look, if shareholders really wanted to, they could nominate a board that will liquidate the company and give the assets back, right? We don't have, as far as I know, any single instance where that's either happened or has been tried, right? And it seems to me that the partial instances of this that we do know, now you might pull one out of your sleeve, but the partial instances that we do know, share buybacks, happen at the discretion, as far as I understand, happen at the discretion of management, right? So that's the first point. Our asset lock-in, entity shielding, and the whole idea of setting up the corporation as an entity that has contractual individuality, does that not pose a more significant problem for your argument that you admit? The second question is, so you conceded that there's a difference between owning the corporation and owning the assets, right? And you said that no, the corporation owns the assets, but the shareholders are still the owners of the corporation. So then I'm wondering, well, what if they don't own the assets? What's left, right? And maybe formulate it slightly differently. So I agree with you that property rights are usually thought of as a bundle of rights, and we don't have to have the whole bundle in order to be considered owners, right? But then we might end up in a situation where maybe the shareholders have a part of the bundle and the corporation has another part of the bundle. So should we maybe just split the thing in two and say they're both owners in some sense? Now, of course, that's conceptually very unsatisfying, right? But it seems to me that that's the kind of place where we end up if we realize, look, the shareholders have some of these rights that we usually put in that basket, but the corporation has another part of those rights. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. You made like 4 questions. So I don't know if this, I'm sure, but I don't have any case in mind that this has sometimes been tried. I'm sure that shareholders have sometimes liquidated the company, perhaps not because they want their property back, but I'm going to look for that example. But I think they could, and I think it's totally, the fact that they could is enough for my case. And again, I don't think that the legal arguments I provide establish shareholder ownership. I think they sort of like show that the arguments against it are not definitive, right? And we need like additional arguments. Now, there's a certain sense in which I want to say that shareholders are the owners of the corporation's assets, right? Insofar as they can actually have the power to ultimately liquidate the company and give them back, right? But from a legal perspective, it is the corporation that owns it, and the shareholders don't, right? Now, law, I mean, it would be very easy for me if Delaware law would say shareholders own the corporation, right? And even though sometimes judges mention that in Delaware, it's always like in passing, and they consider like, shareholders are owners, but it's not like, explicitly articulated what that means. Now, I think there's a reason for why legal scholars in general, and I think it's a correct reason, try to avoid talking about ownership straight off. And it's because ownership, as you said, is a collection of rights, right? And if you want to understand what exactly ownership means in each instance, it's better to just look at the specific rights, right? So I think from a legal perspective, it's valuable that we don't talk about ownership, because it's kind of like a kind of confused concept. If you want to really understand what ownership means, it's like, it's like this specific set of rights. And if you really understand what shareholder ownership means, just go and read to the different rights they have, right? Now, calling them owners is more like a rhetorical device, or like provides like a perspicuous understanding of what their role is, right? Now, if you want to, so there's different ways of being an owner, and if you look at the specific rights, those define what it is. But the idea of the label owners, I think, is a particularly powerful label that helps us understand what the role is given the rights, right? Now, I find it unpersuasive that by defining who owns the corporate assets, that should be defined who controls the corporation, right? Because I think the corporation is different from its assets. And therefore, I'm not particularly persuaded by the fact that, the corporation's owning the assets entails that it owns itself, right? Now, there's one thing that I thought you were going to mention that you didn't mention about Sipley, which is that he has this view about why corporations have like a public function and shareholders are not the owners. They're kind of like the creature of the state, that relies on like how initially corporations always had these like public charters that were always done for the public good. And then, he talks about how then, Delaware and other states began sort of this competition, and then, they relinquished those things. And now we just like, it's just very easy to incorporate now. And there's no longer like a public dimension, but that's like, a failure of law. I don't buy that story particularly, right? When corporations were first devised, because they had limited liability, people were very afraid, rightly so, right? But then once they became more popular and different constituencies started to have them became much more popularized, it became like a real problem for legislators to be all the time having to sort of like, agree to sort of like renew their charters, right? And there started to be this sort of like very unhealthy political dimension that was problematic between, owners of corporations tried to get the charters enacted. Now, what happened is like some legislatures, like Delaware or New Jersey, sort of like relinquish all that. It's like, just like whatever you want, just go and register. We just give you that with no questions asked, right? And I think that was in some ways an experiment. And the fact that we have never, ever tried to go back, I think suggests that that experiment has worked well, right? And that, we have kind of like agreed to not having no longer the corporation serve this public purpose, and rather regulate it in different ways, not by having this public charter, but by, like having like regulations and other stuff. Does that address all your questions?
More than that, you actually anticipated my second question about the charter, but I'll come back later.
Okay, yes, thank you, Peter and Santiago. I see Helen Marshall that is willing to ask a question, so thank you, Helen.
Thank you. Thank you for this. I did warn you that I work on the fiduciary duty, so I might bring this up. So I'm going to bring it up now. So I want to really press you on this idea of whether or not what you're doing is fully differentiating between individual investors and individual shareholders. My concern, I suppose, what I'm trying to get here is I think you might be lumping all shareholders together in the same block, whereas what we might need to do is differentiate more between individual shareholders and those which are bought more via the kind of institutional investment route. Because if you're, if you pay into a pension fund and therefore you're paying into the services of a trustee, then as a beneficiary, you to some extent kind of forfeit your power and your control, because you're going into to a large extent a non-consultative relationship. So and work's being done looking at how that then leads to apathy, and this is when I started to pick up on your route here to do with apathy. So I want to press you on whether or not you think that to some extent there needs to be a clearer differentiation between individual ownership, the shareholders, and individuals who to some extent have a learnt apathy because they more or less rescind their power to a trustee, and how that might fit within your model here. And the reason I bring it up is because it's kind of this idea of the fact that if your testimony has never been sought from you as a beneficiary because you're seen to pay into a fund, then you do take on an apathy, and it's an accrued apathy. So yeah, I just wonder what your thoughts were on the need to differentiate clearly between the levels of shareholders.
Great, thank you for the question. So let me, I need to ask for clarification, but before doing that, clearly the kind of paper works particularly well if you think about a corporation owned by just individual shareholders. And there's certain considerations that emerge when you think about the fact that a lot of the big investors are institutional investors. Now, is your question that that the institutional investors are apathetic, or that the shareholders, sorry, not the shareholders, the beneficiaries of those pension funds are apathetic?
Yeah, the latter. So the people who pay into those pension funds have a learned apathy because they essentially rescind their power over to the trustee, i.e. the pension manager, fund manager. Yeah.
Now, I think when you think about the institutional investor is the shareholder of a corporation, right? The pensioner, you could think, is the ultimate shareholder insofar as, there's this kind of connection of fiduciary duties from the board to the institutional investor to the individual beneficiary. In that sense, you can think, well, the ultimate shareholder is that one, right? But properly speaking, the shareholders are just the ones that own shares, right? And you could think of the institutional investor as, actually it is like a corporation on which has a particular client, right? Which is the pensioner, right? Now, why would thinking that the institutional investor is an institutional investor change anything going what I've said? So I'm not saying that, yeah. Why would thinking that a lot of the shareholders are institutional investors change my account or challenge?
Yeah. It's more to do with where the level of apathy sits, I think, is where I'm thinking about this. Because if this idea is to try to encourage accountability or responsibility, then where within that chain of power essentially does that sit? Because there are concerns about whether or not proxy voting is used sufficiently in order to be able to bring down remuneration, for example, and whether or not institutional investors are using those proxy votes. So I think it's about trying to think through if you're trying to allocate the idea of ownership and power together, where does the actual ultimate accountability sit within that power chain, as it were? Because ultimately within the fiduciary duty, there is asymmetrical power because power is rescinded from the beneficiary to the trustee. So that's all I would encourage the direction of the thinking to go in, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to make the case in the paper that the ultimate investor is the owner. I'm just trying to make the argument that the shareholders are the owners, right? Now, I think because of the kind of levels of apathy and the levels of kind of fiduciaries and which, one fund invests in another fund and so forth, and you end very lately in the shareholder, in the ultimate investor, that investor might be so removed from power that investor might be more problematically considered an owner, right? But my claim is only that, the shareholders of a corporation should be considered its owners. And I don't think that I mean, there's all kind of interesting questions about what are the obligations that pension funds have to the beneficiaries, right? And whether they should get more input from them, which I think they should. Peter has actually written on that. He has a great paper on the fact that pension funds should get more input about what the beneficiaries want to be done with the money and how they think about their moral values.
It should be
So I
more
agree with that.
it should be more consultative, yeah. So,
Yeah, but
yeah.
that's like I think an orthogonal question of whether they're owners or not, right? And if you think that there should be more consultation and there should be more responsiveness, you're tacitly agreeing that yeah, they're owners because we should consult more with them instead of like just the pension fund deciding on its own what should be done, right?
Yeah.
Or the board deciding on its own what should be done.
Yeah, I think where I'm going with this is the origins of the apathy needs to be fully surfaced, I think. Yeah, in order to be able to then kind of decide accountabilities. Yeah, that's where.
I mean, when I was talking about apathy, I'm just sort of like relying on this very kind of like pervasive point in the economic and law literature, which is that when there's a collective action problem when you have many, many shareholders, because their investment is so small that putting the effort to be informed, given that they have so little power, is not worth it, and therefore nobody gets informed, and therefore nobody does anything, right? This was not like I tried to identify what is the specific type of apathy. It was just like diversify shareholders when the numerous face challenges to sort of coordinate that have to do like a collective action problem, I think.
Thank you.
No, thank you for the question.
Okay, I don't know if there are other questions.
Sam had a question before.
Yeah, I see Samuel Mortimer. So thank you, Samuel. You can ask your question, but your microphone is turned off. Okay, you're having problems, and
you can write it down if you want. Chris, do you have any questions? Or if not, Peter can just like come back at me while Sam writes his question down.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Peter has a question, and maybe I have a question. I don't know if you can go, Peter. You can go first if you.
No, we'll do a first round. You go, and I'll wait.
Okay. Yes. My question. So thank you, Santiago, again. My question is about the notion of common good, and so how do you define it, and do you mean common good for the company or the corporation, or the common good for society, or for both? And so if your view on ownership is meant to promote or hinder one of them, hope it's clear.
Yeah. So I'm writing this paper that I have to revise, where I talk about, I precisely talk about these two dimensions, right? Now, in this paper, first of all, I don't want to define the common good. I want to be very wishy-washy about it, because that's like a whole new problem, right? But it's like, whatever your understanding of the common good is, right? And the common good, I mean the common good of society, right? And you can have it as big as you want. If you think the common good of society should be the whole world, that's fine. If you think it should be the state, that's fine. Whatever common good you have, right? There's certain considerations beyond the considerations of shareholders themselves that set up and define what are some of the limits on what they might want to be do, or what the company might do, and what they might want the company to be doing, right? Like, because even though it's their property, the property is part of a society, and it has to take account of that, and therefore has to take into account that it has to sort of like incorporate and recognize the impact it has in society, the power it has over society, and how it can be used responsibly within that society, right? Now, in a different paper, also argue that the best way for managers and boards to think about shareholders, and shareholders, even though they're pretty uniform, they still have a lot of like divergences, like risk tolerance, different kind of like moral values, that the right way to think about shareholders is, and what they're supposed to be doing is promoting the common good of shareholders, right? Now, the common good of shareholders is limited by the common good of society at large, but there's also the company itself should be trying to promote the common good of shareholders. Does that address your point? And both cases have been very wishy-washy of what common good means.
Thank you.
Okay, and Sam connected again, and now he has a mic.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. So firstly, thank you very much for the talk. I really enjoyed that, and I'm probably persuaded, but I wanted to push back on something earlier just to see how you respond. You talked about Elon Musk buying Twitter as an example of how shareholders can ultimately end up exercising a lot of power over companies. But I mean, one thing that Elon Musk did, as well as buying out all the shares, is he then took the company private, and it was only by doing that, I think, that he gained the power to influence the company in various different ways. And so I was wondering whether you see the distinction between public and private companies as having any bearing here. So, because it does seem that there's a difference in law in various jurisdictions between an investor-owned company, so an investor-owned private company, and the same people owning shares collectively in a publicly listed company. There's various differences in what kind of rights they have, for example. So I was wondering if that distinction matters. In other words, might it be the case that, in an investor-owned company, of course, the investors own the company, but in a public company which has shareholders, maybe they don't own the company?
Yeah. So if there was a fundamental corporate governance change between private and public, I would be much more willing to agree that the public company shareholders might not be the owners of a public company, and that when they sort of like converted, then they kind of like are sort of like relinquishing their ownership in exchange for some things. Now, when you think about it from the perspective of our shareholder, I would find it really weird that I would like to invest in a public company where I am not the owner versus investing in a private company where I am the owner, right? So second, as far as I understand the law, and I'm going to ask more, but I'm pretty sure that there's no corporate governance changes. I think the main reason why Twitter became private is because by taking it private, you don't have to make a lot of disclosures that are, first of all, very expensive, and second, kind of like make public information that you might prefer to keep private, right? Like there's kind of like information you might, because you don't need to have like, to be clear, to make all the disclosure, you just want to keep it private. And I think that's one of the reasons why when you have few shareholders, they typically become private. But that's not always the case. There's many companies that have majority stakes and are still public because they don't mind the disclosure requirements. Does that help?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, firstly, I suppose, why would Twitter not have gone private beforehand if it could avoid these disclosures, and if it has that interest in avoiding the disclosures?
Oh, because they have to, when you cross a bar, you are forced to have disclosures. And also, if you want public investment, if you want small investors to invest, you want them to feel safe that they're going to be getting disclosures, right? So it's both attractive for public investing to become public, and sometimes it's required to have the disclosures when you have too many investors. I think the margin might be 2,000 or something. When there's some number of investors, you have to become public.
Okay.
And sometimes, if you don't have that margin, it's valuable to become public because you want, by having those disclosures, you incentivize minority shareholders to invest.
Yeah. Okay. That I buy that. On your first point about governance structures, changing governance structures between public and private. I mean, one difference is that if you're a private investor in company, you can sort of you can have some control over who your co-investors sell their shares to, whereas you can't if you're a public company. And that seems like an important difference of sorts, I think. So I don't know what you've thought about that.
I don't think that's true. I mean, there's some companies, private companies, that when they're set up, they have conditions about who to whom could you sell shares, and conditions to ensure that, you know, the shareholders, the current shareholders, which are often few, have control and might want to sort of like veto things. But that's not always the case. So for instance, there's this famous case, which is what's the Craigslist, right? So Craigslist had only 3 shareholders, which was the 2 co-founders and then 1 employee. And they just gave him some shares because they were hippies. And the shares become super, super expensive. And at some point, the employee just like sold his shares to eBay. They didn't want him to sell the shares to eBay, but he did. And once eBay has shares to eBay, then they were able to like sue Craigslist for not trying to make more profits. So I don't think that it's generally the case private companies in themselves have limits on how shares can be traded. I think public companies don't have them, right? I think you're right about that. But again, one of the reasons for that is that incentivizes minority shareholders, because as soon as you don't want the shares, you can just sell it in the market. You don't need approval or there's no veto for you to sell them.
Thank you.
But Sam, if you learn about, if I'm getting any of the law wrong, or if this law is different, for instance, in the UK or in Australia, or it would be great to know. Like, I don't want to sort of like, you know, yeah.
So thank you, Santiago. Thank you, Samuel. And maybe there is Peter with another question, one final question, I guess.
Thank you. So you brought up David Sipley's point about the charter as the place ultimately where the rights of shareholders are defined. Now I want to frame that argument in a particular way, right? So because you use this argument of second potentiality, right? So you said, look, shareholders have these ownership rights. They don't necessarily exercise them all the time, but they could, right? So I think we could, and they can, right? I think we could make an argument of second potentiality about the charter, right? So the charter, according to Sipley, is the place where the right to residual profits and the voting structure of the corporation are specified. But this can be changed, right? Now, then the question is, which of these potentialities is more fundamental? And it seems to me that the charter is more fundamental than the ownership rights that you invoke of the shareholder. Because if we change the charter, those ownership rights or those rights that we've assigned to the shareholders, they go away, right? So if that's true, then this is maybe an explanation why legal scholars are reluctant to say that shareholders are the owners of the corporation, because they're only contingently so. They're not, it's not a necessary feature of the investment cooperative, as Hansman calls it, that shareholders have these rights. It's only the case because it was put in the charter, right? Now, as Sipley says, well, but look, if we look back in history, there was a time where we revised these charters regularly, and if we still did that, then we would realize that this is contingent. So then the place, if that story holds, then the place we end up is one where you would be right that at the moment as it stands, we might be right in calling shareholders owners, perhaps to some extent, right? But this is something that is contingent and could be changed at any moment. It's not an inherent feature of the investment cooperative.
Yeah, thank you. This is great. I think I talked about this. So I totally agree. The charter can be changed at any time, and anyone else can become an owner, or it can become a nonprofit where it has no owners, right? Now, here's 2 features that I want to emphasize. First of all, it is the shareholders who have to agree and vote on a change of charter, right? The charter cannot be changed by the board. It's one of the things that shareholders have to actually vote on it and approve it. And I think usually not by a small minority, right? So first of all, the charter change has to be approved by the shareholders, suggesting that they are actually the owners. Now, of course, once the charter is changed, they are no longer the owners. And that's fine by me. I don't care. But usually when the charter is changed, that's often no longer also a corporation. If the employees become the owners, that becomes a cooperative, and it has a different legal structure and different tax conditions and actually tax benefits, right? Now, I said in the talk, employees are owners in first potentiality. The charter can change, right? So they also have the power to become owners, but the power is like requires shareholders to actually change the charter for them to get it, right? It's like the baby who needs to be trained in French. In that sense, I think, yeah, every human being has in first potentiality the ability of own a corporation or an organization, but it's only shareholders who have it in second potentiality because the charter actually gives them these powers, which I think are ownership powers and rights. Does that make sense?
Well, it definitely makes me go back to this question, and before I give my next business ethics course.
That's great. I'm happy to come to your class, like resume or something.
Okay, so thank you, Peter, again, and thank you, Santiago. If there are no other questions, maybe we could stop here. And thank again Santiago, and I hope to see you soon here on the Financial Line seminars. And I wish you
the invitation.
I mean,
it's not the most popular topic, but I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And so thank you again for delivering it. And so see you soon. Bye, Santiago, and bye, everybody. And thanks for being here today.
Nice to meet you.